Sarah Jenkins opened her mailbox on a Tuesday morning in March 2016. Inside was a letter from a credit monitoring service. Her credit score had dropped 97 points overnight. She called immediately. The representative explained 3 new credit card accounts had been opened in her name, all at Wells Fargo, all maxed out, all delinquent. Sarah had never opened these accounts. She called Wells Fargo. After 2 hours on hold, a representative told her she must have forgotten. Sarah insisted she hadn't. The representative suggested maybe someone stole her identity. But all the accounts listed her correct information, her actual Wells Fargo branch, even her real email address. This wasn't identity theft. This was Wells Fargo. And Sarah wasn't alone. This was 3.5 million people. Between 2011 and 2016, Wells Fargo employees secretly opened more than 3.5 million bank accounts and credit cards without customer authorization. They forged signatures, they created fake email addresses, they moved money between accounts without permission, and they did it to meet impossible sales quotas. This wasn't a rogue employee in a single branch. This was systematic fraud across all 50 states involving thousands of workers over 5 years. Wells Fargo wasn't some fly-by-night operation. This was a 164-year-old institution, the bank that survived the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the bank that weathered the Great Depression, the bank that emerged from the 2008 financial crisis stronger than almost anyone else. In 2015, Wells Fargo was the most valuable bank in America, worth $275 billion. Warren Buffett called it a fortress. The Stagecoach logo represented reliability, frontier American trust. So how does a bank this established, this trusted, this successful commit fraud on this scale? The answer isn't what you think. This wasn't about greed alone. This was about a business model that made fraud inevitable. A culture where ethics became an obstacle to survival, and a regulatory system that failed to stop it until millions of people had already been hurt. This story took whistleblowers a decade to expose. It took a federal investigation to confirm. And it took a congressional showdown to force even partial accountability. This is the story of how America's most trusted bank betrayed 3.5 million customers, one fake account at a time. The fraud didn't start as fraud. It started as a strategy. 8 is great. That was Wells Fargo's mantra. 8 products per customer. A checking account, a savings account, a credit card, a debit card, maybe a mortgage, an auto loan, investment products, insurance. The logic was simple. The more products a customer has with you, the stickier they become. They're less likely to leave. Cross-selling wasn't unique to Wells Fargo. After the 2008 financial crisis nearly destroyed the banking industry, banks needed a new revenue model. Risky mortgage-backed securities were out. Retail customer fees were in. Every major bank pushed cross-selling. But Wells Fargo took it further. Cross-selling wasn't just encouraged, it became the only metric that mattered. By 2010, Wells Fargo's leadership was obsessed with it. CEO John Stumpf bragged about it in earnings calls. Carrie Tolstedt, head of the community banking division, made it her religion. Branches competed on leaderboards. High performers got bonuses, promotions, recognition at company events, and the quotas kept rising. By 2011, the pressure had become unbearable. Imagine you're a personal banker at a Wells Fargo branch in Phoenix. You make $32,000 a year. You have a family to support. Every morning you walk into work knowing your day is defined by numbers. Your quota? Open 20 new checking accounts, 20 credit card applications, 20 debit cards, plus loans, plus insurance referrals, plus investment product pitches. Every single day. Your branch has maybe 30 to 40 customers walk through the door on a good day. Most already have accounts. Most don't want more products. The math doesn't work, but your manager doesn't care about math. At the morning meeting, she writes everyone's numbers on a whiteboard. Yours are in red. She asks, "Are you committed to this team?" She tells you the branch in Scottsdale hit their numbers. She wants to know why you can't. If you hit your quota, a bell rings. Everyone claps. You get a gold star next to your name. If you don't, you get written up. You get threatened. You get told you might not be a good fit for Wells Fargo. And here's the thing. You need this job. You've got rent due in 6 days. Your daughter needs new glasses. You can't afford to get fired. So you do what everyone else is doing. You cheat. The tactics were surprisingly simple and disturbingly effective. When a customer came in to open a checking account, you'd open 2. One they asked for, one they didn't. You'd forge their signature on the second application. You'd use a fake email address, something like customer@wellsfargo.com, so the confirmation went nowhere. If a customer came in to deposit a check, you'd tell them you needed to verify their information. While they waited, you'd submit a credit card application in their name. The card would be mailed to the branch, and you'd destroy it. Some employees opened accounts using slight variations of customer names. John Smith, J. Smith, John A. Smith, all the same person, all separate accounts. Others would move small amounts of money between customer accounts without authorization, just enough to generate activity, to make the fake accounts look real in the system. The fraud was documented in court records, employee testimonies, and federal investigations. These weren't rumors. These were confessed tactics, admitted in sworn statements. And here's what made it so insidious. Most employees told themselves they weren't really stealing. They weren't taking money from customers, not directly. They were just hitting numbers. They rationalized it. I'm not hurting anyone. I'm just surviving. But management knew they had to. Regional managers saw the patterns, branches opening hundreds of accounts per day in towns of 5,000 people. Data analysts saw the red flags, same-day multiple account openings, accounts opened and closed within hours, fake email patterns. And they did nothing, because those same managers earned bonuses tied to branch performance. Their compensation depended on those fake accounts counting as real. When questioned, they looked the other way. When employees complained, they called them underperformers. When the data screamed fraud, they called it success. Who were these employees creating fake accounts? They weren't career criminals, they were single mothers, recent college graduates, immigrants chasing the American dream, people who needed the job to survive. Most made between $30,000 and $35,000 a year, barely enough to live on in many cities where Wells Fargo operated. They were told this was normal in banking, that every bank did it, that if they wanted to succeed, they needed to be team players. Psychologists call it normalized deviance, when unethical behavior becomes so routine that people stop seeing it as unethical. When everyone around you is doing it, when management rewards it, when refusing means losing your livelihood, the line between right and wrong blurs. One former employee later testified, "I cried in my car every day after work. I knew it was wrong. But I had a mortgage. I had kids in school. I couldn't quit." Another said, "They made us feel like we were failures if we couldn't hit the numbers, so we did what we had to do." This wasn't a few bad apples. Between 2011 and 2016, thousands of employees across more than 5,000 branches participated in the fraud. Not because they were bad people, because the system made honesty impossible. And for 5 years, no one stopped it. The fraud didn't go unnoticed. People tried to stop it. They tried for a decade. In 2005, 11 years before the scandal broke publicly, the first internal ethics complaints were filed at Wells Fargo. Employees reported managers pressuring them to open unauthorized accounts. The complaints were logged, investigated, and quietly buried. In 2007, an internal audit flagged unusual account opening patterns at branches across California. Management's response: blame individual branches. No systemic review. By 2008, complaints to Wells Fargo's ethics hotline had escalated. Employees were calling anonymously, reporting fraud, begging for help. The pattern was always the same. An employee reports misconduct. An investigation is opened. Then, within weeks, that employee is fired for performance issues or not being a team player. They're offered a small severance package with one condition: sign a non-disclosure agreement. Don't talk to the press. Don't talk to regulators. Disappear. And most did, because they needed that severance check, because fighting Wells Fargo meant legal bills they couldn't afford, because the system was designed to silence them. But some refused to stay silent. Yesenia Guitron was a personal banker in Los Angeles. In 2008, she watched her manager open fake accounts daily. She refused to participate. She reported it to the ethics hotline. 3 weeks later, she was fired. The reason given: not meeting sales expectations. Duke Tran was a branch manager in 2011. He saw the fraud, documented it, and called the ethics hotline with evidence. He thought he was doing the right thing. He thought Wells Fargo would want to know. He was fired within a month. Same reason: performance issues. As part of his severance, he was forced to sign an NDA. He couldn't tell anyone what he knew. Between 2011 and 2016, Wells Fargo fired over 5,300 employees officially for not meeting sales goals. But later investigations revealed the truth. Many were fired for refusing to commit fraud, for having a conscience. The ones who cheated kept their jobs. The ones who didn't were eliminated. This wasn't accountability. The first public crack. December 2013, Los Angeles Times reporter E. Scott Record published an investigation that should have ended everything. He interviewed dozens of fired Wells Fargo employees. They all told the same story: impossible quotas, systematic fraud, retaliation against whistleblowers. The article was detailed. It was damning. It was public. Wells Fargo's response? These are isolated incidents involving a small number of employees. We have robust internal controls and ongoing reviews. We take ethics seriously. Translation: we're not changing anything. And for 2.5 years, they didn't have to, because the regulators didn't act. Why? Regulatory capture. The agencies responsible for overseeing banks, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Reserve, were historically staffed by former bank executives. There's a revolving door: work as a regulator, then leave for a lucrative job in banking. It creates conflicts. It creates hesitation. Wells Fargo had political connections, a powerful lobbying arm, and until 2016 they seemed untouchable. But the cracks were spreading, and eventually the facade couldn't hold. The investigation. In 2015, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, an agency created after the 2008 crisis, specifically to protect consumers from banks, opened a formal investigation into Wells Fargo. The CFPB was different from the older, cozier regulators. It had teeth, and it started biting. Investigators subpoenaed internal documents. They interviewed hundreds of current and former employees. They analyzed account data going back years. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency joined the investigation. So did the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. What they found was worse than anyone imagined. Not hundreds of fake accounts, not thousands, millions. The fraud wasn't limited to California. It was in all 50 states. Every region, every type of branch. It was systematic, top to bottom, coast to coast. And it had been going on for at least 5 years, probably longer. The announcement. September 8th, 2016. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau held a press conference. They announced the largest fine in the agency's history, $185 million, $100 million to the CFPB, $35 million to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, $50 million to the City of Los Angeles. The findings were devastating. At least 2 million unauthorized deposit accounts had been opened. 565,443 unauthorized credit card applications had been submitted. 85,000 of those accounts had been charged fees or penalties for services customers never asked for. The fraud dated back to at least 2011. Some evidence suggested it started earlier. Over 5,300 employees had been fired over the 5-year period, but none of the executives who created the system that incentivized fraud. Wells Fargo's stock dropped 3.3% in a single day. Nearly $9 billion in market value evaporated. But the financial hit was nothing compared to what came next. CEO John Stumpf's response. John Stumpf had been CEO of Wells Fargo since 2007. Under his leadership, the bank had become the most valuable in America. He'd earned hundreds of millions in compensation. His first public statement after the CFPB announcement blamed individuals who did not honor our values. He refused to call it fraud. He called it bad behavior by team members. In interviews, he claimed he'd only learned of the full scale of the problem in 2013, despite internal emails later showing executives were briefed much earlier. He took zero personal responsibility. He did not resign. He did not forfeit his compensation. He said he was accountable, but offered no specifics on what that meant. The public was furious. Social media exploded with hashtag Wells Fargo scandal. Customers closed accounts by the thousands. Protests erupted outside branches. Cable news ran the story nonstop. This wasn't just a banking scandal. This felt personal. Everyone knew someone who banked with Wells Fargo. This could have been your mom, your neighbor, you. And then came the congressional hearing. The congressional hearing. September 20th, 2016. The Senate Banking Committee called John Stumpf to testify. The hearing was televised on CSPAN. Millions watched. Senator Elizabeth Warren's questioning became instant viral content. You squeezed your employees to the breaking point, and she said. You fired thousands of them for not meeting impossible sales quotas. And when the scandal broke, you blamed them. Stumpf stammered. Senator, I'm accountable. You should resign, Warren interrupted. You should give back the money you took while this scam was going on, and you should be criminally investigated. The room went silent. Senator Sherrod Brown asked a simpler question. Mr. Stumpf, why are you still drawing a paycheck? Stumpf couldn't answer. He deflected. He repeated talking points about accountability without offering details. He claimed this was the work of a few thousand bad employees, not the system he and Carrie Tolstedt had built. His performance was a disaster. Clips circulated everywhere. The evasions, the squirming, the refusal to take real responsibility. The pressure became unbearable. On October 12, 2016, 1 month after the CFPB announcement, John Stumpf resigned as CEO. He forfeited $41 million in unvested stock. But he kept the hundreds of millions he'd already cashed out over the years. No criminal charges were filed against him. Carrie Tolstedt, the architect of the 8 is Great strategy and head of the community banking division, had already announced her retirement in July 2016, conveniently just before the scandal broke publicly. She was initially set to leave with a $125 million retirement package. Public outcry forced Wells Fargo to claw back $19 million. She still walked away with over $100 million. And at the time, she faced no criminal charges either. It felt like justice, but it wasn't, not yet. Behind every fake account was a real person, someone who trusted Wells Fargo, someone who was betrayed. Let's talk about them. There was a small business owner in California. He discovered 3 unauthorized credit cards had been opened in his name. His credit utilization ratio spiked. His credit score dropped from 780 to 680. When he applied for a business loan to expand his company, he was denied. He lost a major contract because he couldn't get the financing. He spent over 40 hours on the phone with Wells Fargo trying to fix the problem. He never received a meaningful apology. There was an elderly retiree in Arizona living on a fixed income. She was meticulous with her finances, had to be. 1 month, she was charged $1,500 in overdraft fees on an account she didn't open. Wells Fargo had auto-transferred money from her checking account to cover the phantom account's fees. She missed her rent payment. She was nearly evicted. When she called Wells Fargo, they told her to file a dispute. It took 3 months to resolve. She told a reporter, I felt violated. They stole my trust. There was a young professional in Illinois applying for her first apartment in a new city. Her application was denied. When she checked her credit report, there was phantom debt, a delinquent Wells Fargo account she'd never opened. She lost the apartment. She had to stay in an extended stay hotel for 3 months while she fought to clear her credit. The damage took 2 years to fully disappear. There was a veteran in Texas whose VA benefits were direct deposited into Wells Fargo. An unauthorized account triggered IRS reporting issues. His benefits were delayed during the investigation. When he called Wells Fargo for help, they told him to file a dispute. It took 6 months. These weren't isolated cases. These were patterns. Thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands, had their lives disrupted, their credit damaged, their trust destroyed. The scale of the harm is hard to fully grasp. 3.5 million unauthorized accounts. That's more than the population of Chicago. Customers were charged an estimated $2.6 million in improper fees, overdraft fees, monthly maintenance fees, late fees, all on accounts they never asked for. Thousands saw their credit scores drop. Some were denied mortgages. Some were denied jobs because employers checked credit. Some paid higher interest rates on loans because their credit was damaged. And many victims never even knew they were victims until Wells Fargo sent notification letters in 2016 and 2017, years after the fraud occurred. Class action lawsuits were filed across the country. Eventually, Wells Fargo settled for $142 million to compensate victims. But here's the brutal math. $142 million divided among millions of victims. Most received around $25. $25 for having their credit ruined, for hours spent on hold, for stress, anxiety, and violation of trust. The lawyers representing the victims received $24.6 million in fees. The time cost alone was staggering. Victims spent hours, sometimes dozens of hours, disputing charges with Wells Fargo. Navigating credit bureaus to fix their reports, Wells Fargo's customer service was overwhelmed. Wait times exceeded 2 hours. And then there's the emotional cost. Financial trauma is real. For some victims, the experience triggered anxiety, sleeplessness, PTSD symptoms. They couldn't trust banks. They couldn't trust institutions. Many closed their Wells Fargo accounts and left. But for low-income customers, switching banks is hard. New banks require minimum deposits. They check credit. If Wells Fargo ruined your credit, other banks might reject you. The cruel irony, the people least able to absorb a financial shock were the most vulnerable to Wells Fargo's fraud. And they were the least able to escape. On February 2, 2018, the Federal Reserve did something it had never done before to a bank this size. It imposed an asset cap. Wells Fargo could not grow beyond $1.95 trillion in total assets. Think about that. The Fed essentially put a ceiling on Wells Fargo's business. They couldn't make more loans, couldn't expand, couldn't increase their balance sheet. Their growth was frozen. It was an extraordinary penalty, a signal that Wells Fargo couldn't be trusted to manage itself. The conditions for lifting the cap were severe: complete overhaul of the board of directors, enhanced compliance systems, independent oversight. Wells Fargo accepted the punishment. They had no choice. And as of 2024, 6 years later, that asset cap is still in place. The Fed hasn't lifted it. It's a real constraint. It limits profitability. It limits competitiveness. It's one of the few penalties that actually hurt. February 21st, 2020. Wells Fargo reached a settlement with the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The number, $3 billion. The breakdown, $500 million in criminal penalties to the DOJ, $500 million in civil penalties to the SEC, $2 billion set aside for a victim compensation fund. Wells Fargo admitted to defrauding customers. That's rare for a major bank. Usually they settle without admitting guilt. The DOJ offered a deferred prosecution agreement, meaning if Wells Fargo stays out of trouble and maintains compliance, the criminal charges will be dropped. No trial, no executives in handcuffs. The $2 billion victim compensation fund sounded significant, but it was distributed over 3 years through a complex claims process. Many victims found it difficult to navigate. Let's put $3 billion in context. In 2019, the year before the settlement, Wells Fargo earned $19.5 billion in profit. The settlement represented about 15% of a single year's profit. When the settlement was announced, Wells Fargo's stock barely moved. The market had already priced in the penalty. Investors knew it was coming, and they knew Wells Fargo would survive it easily. The math was clear. The fraud had been profitable, even after the fines. But the penalties didn't stop in 2020. December 2022, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau fined Wells Fargo another $3.7 billion, the largest fine in CFPB history. Why? Because Wells Fargo kept violating consumer protection laws after the 2016 scandal. They wrongfully foreclosed on homes. They charged improper overdraft fees. They failed to properly compensate victims from the 2016 fake accounts scandal. The pattern was clear. Wells Fargo would get caught, pay a fine, promise to reform, then violate again. Between 2016 and 2023, Wells Fargo paid over $7 billion in fines and settlements related to consumer abuse. $7 billion. And yet, in 2023, Wells Fargo reported a profit of $19.1 billion. The fines were painful, but they weren't existential. The business model survived, the bank survived. And the executives who built the system, most of them survived too. So who went to prison? Almost nobody. In September 2020, 4 years after the scandal broke, federal prosecutors finally indicted Carrie Tolstedt, the former head of community banking. The charges: obstructing a bank examination, conspiracy to commit wire fraud. She was the first senior Wells Fargo executive to face criminal charges. Her trial was delayed multiple times. In September 2023, she pleaded guilty to obstruction. In January 2024, she was sentenced to 3 years in prison. She was also ordered to pay a $17 million fine. 3 years, for a fraud that affected 3.5 million people and lasted 5 years. James Strother, a regional president, pleaded guilty to fraud charges. He received probation, no prison time. And what about CEO John Stumpf, the man at the top? No criminal charges, ever. In 2020, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency banned him from the banking industry. He paid a $17.5 million civil penalty. Combined with the $41 million in stock he forfeited in 2016, his total penalties were around $60 million. But he'd earned over $200 million in compensation during his time as CEO. He kept most of it. Today, he lives comfortably in the Bay Area. No prison, no trial, no handcuffs. The message was clear. If you're a senior executive at a major bank, you're too big to jail. Wells Fargo, of course, promised change. In 2016, they eliminated sales quotas. No more 8 is great, no more daily targets. Between 2017 and 2019, the entire board of directors was replaced. In 2019, they hired a new CEO, Charles Scharf. They launched cultural transformation initiatives, ethics training, whistleblower protections, enhanced compliance monitoring. And yet, the 2022 CFPB find showed that violations continued. Consumer trust surveys consistently rank Wells Fargo among the lowest-rated major banks. The reforms looked good on paper, but the fundamental question remained: had Wells Fargo really changed? Or had they just gotten better at hiding the problems? So why did this happen? The root cause wasn't individual greed, it was structural. Wells Fargo built a system where ethics became an obstacle to survival. When you tie employees' compensation purely to volume metrics, number of accounts opened, number of products sold, you create perverse incentives. You're measuring activity, not value. You're rewarding quantity, not quality. And when those metrics become impossible to hit honestly, people cheat. Cross-selling isn't inherently bad. Most banks do it. But Wells Fargo took it to an extreme. They had no counterbalancing metrics. No measurement of customer satisfaction. No tracking of complaint rates. No analysis of account longevity. If an account was opened and closed the next day, it still counted toward quota. If a customer complained, it didn't matter. The numbers looked good. Other industries learned this lesson decades ago. The medical field doesn't pay doctors per surgery because it would incentivize unnecessary procedures, but banking hasn't evolved. Wells Fargo's failure was a failure of imagination. They couldn't imagine that people would respond to incentives exactly as designed. Corporate culture flows from leadership. John Stumpf and Carrie Tolstedt set the tone. Growth at any cost, hit the numbers, don't ask how. When executives are rewarded for short-term results, they don't ask uncomfortable questions. They don't dig into how those results are achieved. They practice willful blindness. Willful blindness is a legal doctrine. It means if you ignore obvious red flags, you're still culpable. You can't claim ignorance as a defense. Stumpf and Tolstedt saw the data. They saw branches in small towns opening hundreds of accounts per day. They saw the patterns, and they chose not to investigate. Wells Fargo's board of directors failed too. They didn't ask hard questions. They didn't review complaint data. They didn't conduct independent audits. They prioritized stock price over due diligence. This is endemic in American corporate governance. Boards are often too cozy with CEOs. Directors are paid well. They don't want to rock the boat. And when something goes wrong, they claim they didn't know. And where were the regulators? The Los Angeles Times exposed the fraud in 2013. The CFPB didn't act until 2016. Why the 3-year delay? Regulatory capture. The agencies responsible for overseeing banks, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Reserve, are often staffed by former bank executives. There's a revolving door. You work as a regulator for a few years. Then you leave for a lucrative job in banking. It creates conflicts. It creates hesitation. You don't want to be too aggressive against the industry you might join one day. Wells Fargo had a powerful lobbying arm, political connections, campaign donations. They were too big, too important, too connected to be treated like a criminal enterprise. The CFPB was created in 2010 specifically to avoid this problem. It was supposed to be independent, aggressive, consumer-focused. And to its credit, it eventually acted. But even the CFPB faced political attacks and budget constraints. The banking industry lobbied relentlessly to weaken it. Structural reform is nearly impossible when the industry being regulated has this much power. Too big to jail. The core problem is this. Corporations are treated as legal persons, but they don't face personal accountability. When a corporation commits fraud, it pays a fine. The corporation continues operating. Shareholders lose some value. But the executives who made the decisions rarely face prison. Compare. If you steal $500 from a convenience store, you go to prison. If you orchestrate a scheme that steals $500 million through systematic fraud, you pay a fine and retire. Deterrence only works when the consequences outweigh the crime. For Wells Fargo, the fines were painful. $7 billion is real money. But they weren't existential. The bank survived. The executives kept most of their wealth, and the fraud had been profitable overall. The system protects elites. That's not a conspiracy theory, it's observable reality. Until senior executives face real prison time for corporate crimes, this will keep happening. Remember Sarah Jenkins, the woman from the beginning whose credit score dropped 97 points because of fake Wells Fargo accounts? She eventually received a settlement check from the class action lawsuit, $25. It took her 18 months to fully clear the fraudulent accounts from her credit report. She refinanced her mortgage during that time and paid a higher interest rate because of the damaged credit. That cost her thousands. Wells Fargo never called to apologize, never sent a personal letter, just a form notice and a check for $25. She closed her accounts, she moved to a credit union. But the damage wasn't just financial, it was psychological. She told a reporter in 2018, "I don't trust banks anymore. I don't trust that anyone's looking out for people like me." That's the real cost, the loss of trust in institutions. Let's do the final accounting. 3.5 million fake accounts, 5,300 employees fired, most of them scapegoated for a system they didn't create. Over $7 billion in fines and settlements. One executive imprisoned, Carrie Tolstedt, 3 years. 0 CEOs imprisoned. Wells Fargo still operates, still profitable, still one of the largest banks in America. The central irony is this: Wells Fargo built 164 years of trust. They destroyed it in 5 years of systematic fraud, and they survived anyway. What does that tell us about American capitalism? It tells us that corporations can commit crimes and face consequences that don't match the scale of harm. It tells us that fines become a cost of doing business. It tells us that justice operates on different scales for the rich and the poor, for individuals and institutions. Could this happen again? The uncomfortable answer: it already is. Other banks have faced sales practice scandals since 2016, smaller in scale, but the pattern remains. Incentive structures across the financial industry are still flawed. Regulatory agencies are still underfunded and outmatched by bank legal teams. The Dodd-Frank Act, the financial reform law passed after 2008, has been rolled back in several key areas. Oversight has weakened. And the banking lobby remains one of the most powerful in Washington. Without structural reform, real reform that changes how banks are governed, how executives are held accountable, how regulators are empowered, another Wells Fargo is inevitable. It might already be happening at another institution, we just haven't found out yet. So what can you do? Check your bank accounts, monthly. Look for charges you don't recognize, accounts you didn't open, activity that doesn't make sense. Know your rights. If you find fraud, file a complaint with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It's free, it's anonymous, and it matters. Demand accountability, contact your representatives, tell them consumer protection matters, tell them too big to jail isn't acceptable. And remember, banks work for you, not the other way around. Trust takes generations to build. It takes one scandal to destroy. And for 3.5 million customers, Wells Fargo destroyed it, one fake account at a time.